One thing we've learned is the only way you can get dignity from these folks is be powerful as they are. And the only way that happens is with unions.
And if we're going to grow the middle class of this country, we have got to rebuild, strengthen, and expand the trade union movement in America.
There you can see Democratic candidates working to woo the unions in Iowa as we get closer to the caucuses in that state on February 3rd. In fact, all of the frontrunners in the race, they've even unionized their campaign staffs. Democrats, they're battling to win back a lot of the working class voters who went for Trump in 2016, especially in the Rust Belt states that swayed the election. Right now, roughly 15 million American workers belong to unions. That number, it's about 10% of the workforce, but 1 in 5 workers, they were unionized as recently as the 80s. So the numbers have dwindled significantly. My next guest, he has a new book about the history of the labor movement and where it goes from here. It's called Beaten Down, Worked Up: The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. And author Steve Greenhouse joins us now. You know, maybe it's because I'm getting old, but I remember there was a time when being in a union wasn't something anybody said with any hesitation. Now it carries a different connotation depending where you are in this country. Can you pinpoint when the turn happened?
I think it was two things. One, I think a lot of people concluded that union members were making too much money, and corporations really attacked unions very hard. And there was some terrible union corruption, the Irishmen and longshoremen on the waterfront, people heard about union corruption. But I think more recently with the teacher strikes and the Fight for 15, public sentiment is really turning around about unions. 64% of the American public now say they approve of unions. That's nearly the highest rate in 50 years.
I saw a piece on 16 Minutes this past Sunday. I don't know if you caught it, but I was thinking of our coming interview. I'm watching a piece they did in Seattle on the homeless problem. And what struck me was how many people with full-time jobs, they had a postal worker among them, that are living in a tent or their vehicle because they can't afford to put a roof over their heads. And this is the working poor in this country, yet I don't hear them vocalizing or thinking that their first path to remedy is to go through their union or try to organize or whatever else. Intuitively, that's not where they go, where a generation ago, that's where the first place they would have gone, to the union shop steward, or to try to get together to say, we got strength in numbers.
That's a good point. So one of the main points of my book is that, a lot of Americans feel problems at work, but they don't recognize why this is happening. And, we're the only industrialized nation where every worker is not guaranteed paid sick leave. We're the only industrialized nation where every worker isn't guaranteed paid parental leave. The only industrialized nation where every worker isn't guaranteed paid vacation. Our minimum wage is much lower comparatively than in other nations. So I think a lot of workers realize that they're getting the short end of the stick, and they'd like to fix that.
Yet, Stephen, as you saw it play out in the 2016 election, there are a lot of voters who vote against their self-interest, specifically in those purple states here, in the Rust Belts, where a lot of blue-collar guys you would think would vote for the platforms they're hearing from the Democrats. Instead, they voted for Trump, who gave their boss a break, but it's not trickling down to them.
Yeah, I've wrote about labor for 20 years, and when I saw Donald Trump in the Midwest saying, I'm going to bring back all the jobs, when I'm president, no factories are going to close anymore, I thought, this just isn't true. He's just making this stuff up. But apparently, a lot of people bought what he was saying, and they thought he was a champion of workers. And one of the points I make in my book is that Donald Trump is not turning out to be a real champion of workers. He's not doing anything to raise the minimum wage. He, for instance, has helped Wall Street over workers by saying, Wall Street firms no longer have to pledge to act in workers' and retirees' best interests in handling their 401ks. His administration is making it much harder to unionize. So in many ways, Trump really isn't being a great friend of workers. Yes, he's fighting on trade issues, but I argue in my book that he's mucked that up, because if you want to fight with China to get China to be fair on trade, you really need, your allies, Canada and the European Union and Japan, acting hand in hand with you, and instead Donald Trump has alienated our allies in Europe and Canada, and that's made it much harder to improve things on trade and to pressure China.
You know, and I know you covered labor issues with the Times for a long time. It's funny, when we were talking the run-up to this interview, some of the folks I know who are progressive, they rolled their eyes. And I said, well, why? He goes, please. Look at, for example, the guys in the LIRR. He goes, at one point, 90-something% of them were getting disability when they retired. They game the system in ways that we can't without that. In that, has there been an error in some corners of labor where they didn't police the abuses and they've created narratives that maybe don't reflect reality because there may be a singular instance, but nonetheless, you know, cops or firefighters in the last year jacking up their overtime so they'll get pensions the regular guy won't get here, that there were abuses that unions tolerate, and conversely, they don't get sympathy from the general public when it comes time to rallying to their cause?
You know, I grew up on Long Island. I'm a Massapequa boy. I saw some of the stuff that went down on the LIRR where people were taking advantage, and that was very unfortunate. People were taking advantage, taxpayers and LIRR commuters. And you know, unions should not let that happen. Unions should strive very hard to assure honesty. So I think unions, you know, because they were unpopular for some years, as you point out, unions are trying much harder to show we are the friends of the community. You know, we are the friends of other workers. You know, take the recent teacher strikes around the country.
You know, Stephen, I remember covering that story, and what struck me is when I have guests on, they all heard the story about the teacher going into her or his own pocket buying school supplies for the class and not having enough money here to be able, you know, to fill their car with gas going back home here, so they had to carpool. They sold their cause really effectively. And as much as they might have been shut down in other arguments, you looked and you said, my God, these are people working above and beyond what's being asked of them to teach your kids, and they don't have enough money here, you know, to be able to pay for their gas to do a round trip to get home. They effectively communicated how they were harmed. And I now pivot to a story you have in your book, which was the fast food workers in the city. They figured out a way that they said, my God, for $7.25 an hour, we're getting fried here. Look at our arms. Look at like the quality of life. I got fired for eating a chicken nugget, as you report in your story. They communicated it. Is part of this that it's not just saying it's wrong, it's an equal, but actually the narratives, the telling the stories, like you do in your book about, you know, the tomato farmers or whatever. There needs to be, I don't know, I hate to use a Trumpism here, but there's got to be a story attached to it, and more often than not, there's not one.
Absolutely. So, you know, I have a big chapter on the Fight for 15. I was the very first journalist to write about the Fight for 15, and when the first strike began, there were just 200 workers here in New York working at 20 restaurants, and they were saying, you know, we can't live in New York on $7.25 or $8.25 an hour. That's crazy. And they realized that the way to improve things was to band together through collective action. You know, my book, I write about the teacher strikes. I interviewed some teachers in Arizona who hadn't had a raise in 10 years. I interviewed teachers who were making just $33,000 a year. And they said, something's broken here. The system is rigged against us. We have to change it.
Well, it is a really timely book. Again, the title, Beaten Down, Worked Up. Stephen Greenhouse, thanks for the time.
Great to be here. Thank you.
When we come back, we'll talk a little sports. The Mets seem poised to have a new owner, but it's an owner with certainly a checkered past. Buddy's got a big checkbook. So is that all it takes for fans to forgive and forget? We'll talk about him, as well as a lot of past sports greats who've gotten into trouble, even some serious trouble at that. And fans, well, just win, baby. We'll talk that and more with the panel after this.